Hello and welcome, I'm Oles Garjuk and you're watching Head to Head with UATV. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has promised to start a land reform this year. The EU and the IMF have long insisted on opening the agricultural land market. Ukraine has undertaken this obligation both in the association agreement with the European Union and in the Memorandum of Cooperation with the IMF. To talk more about the upcoming land reform in Ukraine, we welcome to our studio today Pavlo Kukhta, economic expert. So hello.
Hello.
And thank you for joining us today.
Thank you.
So as I said, Volodymyr Zelensky and his office promised to start lifting the moratorium on agricultural land sales. And according to Alexei Honcharuk, the deputy head of the president's office, the land sale moratorium may be cancelled by the end of the year. What are your thoughts on opening the land market and on, the abolition of the moratorium?
Oh, this is one of those, let's say, few reforms that are essentially a no-brainer, right? So a ban on selling and buying agricultural land is a very rare thing around the world right now. So I think it only exists in 5 countries apart from Ukraine, and these countries are something like Cuba, Venezuela, Congo, so generally very underdeveloped, Tajikistan, stuff like that. So obviously, this is a very easy and cheap way to stimulate economic growth. There are several models of how things will behave after the land market is opened, depending on what the chosen model is. And in general, they show that the more liberal the model is, so less restrictions, access to foreigners, etc., the more economic growth and investment this generates.
Mm-hmm. What are you rooting for? For the more liberal approach, so to say, model?
Well, in general, modeling clearly shows this. There are certain, let's say, political, economic, maybe constraints or things that have to be kept in mind, mainly not wanting to generate, let's say, large land latifundia, kind of be quasi-oligarchic, so generate some quasi-oligarchs in the agricultural sector. But in general, my own opinion is that this is a bit overrated. There is a different danger, and that danger is that, the effect of the land market is predicated on investment coming in, particularly into the agricultural sector, into people would buy land, create longer-term businesses, create more, value-added, deeper value-added chains in the agricultural sector, so go into food processing, go into, let's say, meat production, something that creates additional value-added over just simple plant and gather some wheat and sell it off each year. Mm-hmm. But this is predicated on the investment coming. And the risk is that the bottleneck for investment is not only, let's say, the inability to buy and sell land, but something else. For example, the absence of a properly functioning property rights protection in the country, raiding, no proper court system, etc., etc. So there is a certain risk that the land reform is done and then it doesn't generate the effects that are expected because other things start kicking in, mainly related to the fact that rule of law is essentially not fully present in the country to the same extent as in other European countries.
So this means if we want to avoid the risks, we have to be fully prepared for the opening of the land market. As I mentioned, the moratorium would be lifted probably as expected until the end of this year, and then the president hopes to open the land market in 2020. What do you think about this time frame? Do you think that this is a good pace and we can have an effective launch of the agricultural land market, or is it too short? So that could be a possible threat that Ukraine might, lag behind with the adoption of some proper legislation, or maybe with the adoption of some proper regulation of the land market. What are your thoughts?
No, I don't think the time frame is an issue. Actually, it should be done as fast as possible because, as experience shows us, if it's delayed, it's not done. It hasn't been done for 20 years, almost 20 years. It's in force since 2000.
Yeah, since 2001.
Right. So
we have this moratorium.
Right. So if you start prolonging it, you never do it. You should do it fast. Question is that there are some things you should do in parallel related to administration of land, etc., and you cannot fail there because otherwise the land market will be problematic. And also you should be in parallel quickly working on fixing the acute problems related to rule of law. So you cannot just do one thing and avoid doing the other things. That's the problem, right? Because if then the land reform will still be better. I mean, it's still, even if nothing else is done, it's still better to do the land reform because it will generate at least some economic growth and some effect, and make the situation at least somewhat better in the rural areas of Ukraine, which are the poorest. But to really make this effective, other things have to be done in parallel, and that's the point. So the point is not the time frame. The point is that things should be done simultaneously on various directions.
I get your point. So let's discuss the possible risks. I do know that some experts are very careful commenting this issue about the land reform, and they're careful saying that maybe it is too fast to open the land market, that Ukraine needs to prepare, as I mentioned in my previous question. So they outlined the risks of food security and an ability of local investors to have an access to the market, just because Ukrainian banking system doesn't really provide loans for buying an agricultural land. And also we know that local businesses do not have this much money and this much financing that maybe that they could be possible competitors on the market to the foreign investors. So that brings up the question about this liberal model, as you mentioned, or having some restrictions and having some kind of regulation and unequal approach based on different factors. For example, like Poland and France and Slovakia are good examples. Or, well, I do not want to use the word good or bad, but those are examples of having some restrictions on their land market based on companies' registration address, nationality, or even on length of time that the buyer is in the agriculture business. So what are your thoughts on this?
In general, what economic models show us is that the less restrictions, the better. The
less restriction is the better
approach for the economy of the country.
Wouldn't it
the less restrictions you put in, the more economic growth you generate by opening the land market. If it's very restricted, it generates very little economic growth.
But would it be possible that there can be a big flow of money in the very beginning, but then there could be evolving some potential threat that Ukrainians...
Personally, I mean, there is this constant, fears that someone will come in and buy up Ukrainian land, but what I would fear more is that no money comes. That's what I would fear more, because we shouldn't really overestimate the value of this land as an asset. I mean, it's obviously a good asset, but it's not something unique. It's not buying land on Mars or something, right? It's not a bonanza.
It's just a
good agricultural land, right?
Yes, good
and very much under investment. Low infrastructure requires a lot of investment to make things work. Requires good legal infrastructure, not to be afraid that your land will somehow end up in someone else's hands, which Ukraine lacks. Huge risks associated with the country, right? Huge distrust towards the country in the business circles around the world. I wouldn't really overestimate the risks. Rather, the problem is, yes, financing is a problem. And again, models show that solving the problem of financing, even making some cheap loans available to farmers via state budget or some other scheme like that, actually helps a lot. So that's a major factor. That's one of the things that should be handled. That's why it requires relatively good administration on part of the government, because this is necessary, again, to generate more effect from the land market.
And it needs to be done simultaneously, as you said.
And it needs to be done simultaneously, and this means it needs to be prepared fast enough and executed fast enough. It's entirely possible to do it in a short time frame, but someone should be doing it, and someone should be the Minister of Agriculture or whoever is doing that should be professional enough and have a professional enough team to actually prepare this and make this work. If it's botched, yes, the effects will be less. But again, regardless of how the market is handled, opening the market is better than not opening the market. That is quite clear. I mean, at this point, after 20 years of this prolonged sales moratorium, the situation is such that not opening it is, in any case, worse than opening it. In any case, concentration of land will happen. It will just happen via long-term not mortgaging of land, but taking it out, long-term, let's say, loaning of this land. It will not, all the negative processes that some people are afraid of, foreigners entering the market, okay, they're entering it as well. They're just taking again into some long-term lease this land instead of buying it outright, or using shadow schemes more and more and more to buy off land, which again is happening.
Agreed.
So again, this thing doesn't work. It was devised as a temporary solution for a couple of years back in 2000. It was just devised to give some breathing space to actually draft a proper law on land market and then launch it. It was supposed to be launched in early 2000. And then for 20 years it got prolonged, and the situation morphed into this crazy thing we have now.
Yes, basically they needed that time to work on the land code, but then they actually referred this moratorium to the land code that they adopted. I mean, the former MPs.
Which was 20 years ago.
Yeah, that was a long time ago. As far as I understand, President's office is thinking about launching a liberal model, issuing equal rights for all the buyers, for the participation in the agricultural land market. And I would like to mention that head of the Office of Effective Regulation, Denis Maluska, believes that in order to launch this land market properly, it is first necessary to adopt a bill to counter raiding and ensure equal access, as we already discussed. But also there is an idea, and actually, according to Maluska, there is a necessity to create an institution that would provide equal access to financing for all market participants, as well as strengthen the work of the State Service for Geodesy, Cartography, and Cadastre, making the implementation of these procedures more efficient. Do you think that there is a need to establish a new institution for that, a new state institution for that?
Well, possibly, but then something needs to be done with the state geocadastre. So the problem is that, I mean, the functions are obviously necessary. Someone should be doing cadastering and other things, land management.
Yeah.
It's done very badly and in a very corrupt fashion now. So it's either reforming this institution or creating something new, transferring the function, closing this thing down. Personally, in general, what we know from experience in Ukraine is that creating new institutions actually works better than trying to reform the old ones. So it's easier and faster.
Well, but then we need to close the old ones.
Yeah, and then the old ones need to be closed.
So you said that basically equal regulation wouldn't really pose a threat to losing the agricultural land in the eyes of Ukrainian farmers for the foreign investors. But could we talk about how much of agricultural land do we have in Ukraine in total? So maybe we can kind of foresee the possible price for 1 hectare and then maybe some revenues that we could get annually.
It depends. We have 21 million hectares in private hands and about 10, I think, in public. But a problem with the public land is that only 1 or 2 million hectares are actually properly cadastered and are good lands. So what happened was that during the 1990s, when land was given out to farmers, or in general to the citizens, usually the best land was given out and the worst one was left in state hands, which means that a lot of it is actually useless. But some parts of it are relatively good. But
so then it's 31 hectares in total.
I think it's 31 million hectares.
But then President refers to 40 hectares.
Yes, that's there is agricultural land which is kind of usable for growing agricultural crops. Then there are other things like the one used for animal husbandry, some not swamps, but some kind of let's say watered areas that are also used in agriculture, but they aren't properly agriculture. And overall, it's 40 plus, I think. But 31, if I'm not mistaken, is the actual the land where you actually plant stuff.
That could be potentially sold. Not all of it, but
no. I mean, but the state only owns about 10 million hectares.
Okay.
That's what it can sell. A large chunk of it is probably unsellable because they are actually useless or bad or the worst land available. The best land is concentrated in private hands. That's 21 million hectares. And I mean, technically they are already, so they are private. You know, you can't sell them or buy them. They're already in private hands.
But if they will be able to buy them
and sell it among themselves, right? So it's essentially will be solved among Ukrainian citizens or foreigners if foreigners are allowed to come in.
Yeah, so the money will be circulating, of course.
Yes, the money and land will be circulating, but it's already privatized, right? So when we're speaking about land privatization, because people sometimes mix these two issues, what can actually be privatized is a couple million hectares of actually state-owned, properly cadastered and relatively good agricultural land. Not that much. It's about only 10% of what the private sector owns.
So basically, we can refer to this 31 hectares.
In
We can
general,
refer to this figure.
I mean, in general, land market opens up for the private citizens. So
For
we
the private
refer to the
citizens.
21
To the
million
21 million
that
hectares.
the private citizens own. Everything else is either a state policy. So what will be done with the state-owned land is a state policy. Sometimes local governments, they also...
Okay, so what could be an approximate price for 1 hectare? I know it depends on the region, it depends on the fertility of the land, but still, what could be the forecast? How much revenues could Ukraine possibly get? Could Ukrainian businessmen, farmers can get annually for selling the land?
It depends. There are different forecasts of how it will play out, starting, let's say, from $1,000 to several $1,000s. It's really hard to say, and I'd be very careful with these assessments.
There was even a version about $10,000, which is which sounds pretty idealistic, I would say.
Yes, but in general, the market will determine that. You know, you cannot estimate before not having any market. You cannot estimate what a market price of something will be if you don't have a market for it, right? You need a market to actually determine how much it costs, taking into account everything in the country. Because again, and I have to remind again, that the absence of land market is not the only bottleneck for investment and development. There are other bottlenecks for investment and development, which, if unsolved, would leave this potential unrealized. So land
but
price
we're talking
will not
about
grow
strategic investment, not about some just
even more
fast
so.
money.
I mean, for a strategic investor, you have to have a long-term view. You have to have some kind of long-term perspective. You have to have clear rules by which you will play in this area, because you're investing hundreds of millions or billions of dollars into the country, right? You should understand by what rules you're going to be working.
What
If
are
the
the
rules
conditions?
don't really work, chances are you will not invest, and that's the problem. So in parallel, okay, the land market is open, the opportunity is there. Will people invest? They have to be sure that this opportunity is actually there and it's not a fake. You know, that it won't be raided from them or confiscated at some point, or something else will happen, right? So they have to have this long-term perspective, especially when we're speaking about essentially an acquisition and big investment into agricultural land. So it's done to launch some kind of big production there, which is always long-term.
Ukraine theoretically would be awaiting some huge investments into the country if Ukraine opens the agricultural land market. But also, well, almost in every interview about foreign investors and foreign investments, my guests outline the biggest problem in Ukraine, judiciary reform. Could it be possible that Ukraine launches the opening of the land market, but the investments won't come just because the judiciary reform is not implemented yet?
It could be possible. Also, we shouldn't
underestimate
the level of problem with the absence of rule of law in the country. So it doesn't just come to some technical changes in the judiciary system. It comes into the country's culture. It's really deeply rooted, which is why I would be careful with any estimates of any reform effects, because investment is really, really hampered by the absence of rule of law. But that doesn't mean that reforms don't generate results. They aren't just as big as maybe on paper or in economic models they would be. So on paper, in economic models, I've heard numbers up to 4% of GDP of additional growth per year from land reform. This is most likely will not happen. Top-ups in the best case scenario, the most liberal reform, properly launched and properly handled, would generate, let's say, 1.5%, maybe 2%, but probably 1.5% of additional growth per year, which is huge. It's essentially 1/3 or half of current economic growth. So huge effect from just one reform if properly handled. And I would expect it to come in 2 or 3 years, not earlier than that. So it's not going to be fast. There are no, there are no silver bullets and no quick solutions to a country that's been failing for a quarter century. We still, this management of expectations has to be done carefully, because people, especially people in Ukraine, they oftentimes really expect some unrealistic, fast results, which are never going to happen.
Yeah, but still, there are some expectations and there are some analysis, and also according to the World Bank, I know that you said that maybe it's too early to foresee something for this land market, but still, according to the World Bank, the lifting of the moratorium would bring the economy some 700 million to $1.5 billion US annually. So somehow the World Bank calculated and issued this kind of analysis,
which is about 0.5% to 1% of GDP per year.
As you said,
not that big. Yes.
Not that much. You said that it could be up to 2%.
It's certainly. I mean, for one reform, for one simple law or sequence of simple laws, it's huge. I mean, it's a no-brainer that it should be done. But again, yes, this is not. We have to clearly understand that this is not a panacea. Right? This is not something that will make the poorest country in Europe somehow rich.
The richest.
Yes.
Okay, yes, I understand you. Well, let's see how this is going to evolve. Thank you so much for commenting on this issue. Thank you for being a guest today. That was Pavlo Kukhta, economic expert. Thank you for watching Head to Head. I'm Oles Gerjuk. Goodbye.